I brought this along just in case. Okay, today is April 29th, 1992, and I'm sitting in the Hastings Historical Society building on Washington Avenue having tea and a conversation with Mildred Gallik. And I welcome you here, and wanted to ask you just a little bit about your general background. If you could, tell us a little bit, a brief history of your family and where they came from, some of the stuff that you were telling us.
Thank you, Abby. My family actually lived in Yonkers, and I was born in the Bryn Mawr section of Yonkers. And when I was in college, my parents were looking for another place to live, and this was in 1945. And if you go back that far, you might remember it was during the war and housing was at a premium. There was an ad in the Herald-Statesman for a small house in Hastings, and they responded to that ad. And when they came to look at it, they discovered that the owner was Mrs. Denton, who was principal of No. 5 School in Yonkers, where I went as a child and my brother and sister. So it was really coincidental that in all this area we found somebody we knew. She owned that property and the house next to us, along with the home she lived in, and I don't know the number of it, but the O'Brien family now live in that abode. And when my parents came to see the house, she was very concerned as to who she would give it to. And when she discovered, and obviously she did remember that we had gone to No. 5 School, and the fact that my brother was a veteran, my parents were fortunate in being able to buy this house. And it really was a very little house. It was, she called it the chauffeur's home. And it was at 54 Pinecrest Parkway, and next to us there were 2 empty lots which Mrs. Denton owned, along with the house where the Bradys now live, which was also hers. And the assistant principal of No. 5, Miss Cronk, and a teacher, Miss Malcolm, lived in that home next to ours. Now, why this was called a chauffeur's home, I really don't know, but perhaps I could get some more details later. But it was set way back on the property and looked like a little Swiss chalet. And it was very small. It only had 3 rooms, but I was away at school. My brother was in the service, so for my parents it was fine. And during those years, or I should say before that, I should talk a little about my family background. My parents are Czechoslovakian, and they came to the United States when they were small. My father was 6, I think. My mother was 12, and they lived in the New York area. And because of their ethnic background, they clung very closely to the Czechoslovakian group, which was a very strong one in New York City. And at that time, there were many Czechoslovakians who lived up in the east side in the 70s, and there was a gymnastic organization called the Sokols, which my parents belonged to. And this was their social life, and also gymnastics was a very large part of their extracurricular activities after working. And when my parents married, they moved to Yonkers. And I was born in Yonkers, and the home that they built along with my father's sister and his mother actually was built where the Sawmill River Parkway now is, and it was right near Lockwood Avenue. And I think my sister was had already arrived, and they had to move the house from the Parkway to Lockwood Avenue, because they were going to build the Parkway, obviously. And so I was born in this home on Lockwood Avenue and then went to No. 5 School. And from there, in the 40s, well, we lived in several places, but one of the key places we lived was in Sokol Hall, which was on Yonkers Avenue and the Parkway, where my father was manager of this hall, which the organization had built for their members in the Yonkers area. And it was a center, again, of activity, the social life gymnastic organizations, and we would have meets and sort of like Olympics today. And so I grew up in this background. And when it was sold, my parents had to find a place to live, so ultimately this is why we came to Hastings. Their ties have really not been in Hastings at all since they moved here in 1945. They have clung to their friends and the organization of the Sokols all through their lifetimes. And we are not church members, so they did not join a church.
So it wasn't like you investigated Hastings, like your family investigated Hastings as an ideal place that they'd want you to be brought up in. It was
a necessity, really, more than anything. And I might say, Abby, too, one of the reasons they did not pursue that so much was I had already graduated from high school and was in college when they moved here. And as I said, my brother was just coming out of the service and he was going on to college. So the one criteria, I think, was the convenience to Yonkers, and because my mother did not drive, and so she could have easy access to a bus. That was a key factor for her to consider. And they considered themselves very fortunate to be able to find a home in Hastings, which they particularly liked the area.
Did the subject of that neighborhood being an integrated neighborhood ever come up, or was that something that was spoken about at the time when you were looking for a house? Or,
to my knowledge, I don't think it did come up, although I think my parents were aware of the fact that the Adams family lived down on the drive, and I'm not sure, but I will check to see whether there were others who lived in our particular area, but no one within close proximity, and that I don't ever remember any conversation at all when I came home from college as to the makeup of the neighborhood. Not at all. Mm-mm.
And so you yourself really didn't socialize within Hastings. When you came back, you really didn't have any friends here, or trying to develop any?
None at all, because I was just a freshman in college, and then of course just came home for vacations and worked in the city, or worked one summer I worked up in Poughkeepsie, New York. So that the only reason I came here was because my parents lived here. And then when I graduated from college, I worked in New Jersey, so here again I would only come home periodically for weekends. So my interests were really never in Hastings, other than being a commuting town. And then when I got a job in New York, I did come back home to live. But here again, working in the city and having all my friends in the city, my social life and all activities were more concentrated there, plus going back to New Jersey where I had worked for 6 years, so my friends were there too.
Did your parents ever get involved in the community, even in terms of buying food at local stores or getting haircuts in local establishments? Or
oh yes, they shopped in the stores. And at that time, I'm trying to think of the name of the market down on Warburton Avenue. It was a supermarket at that time, but no, my mother knew the butcher, and then she was very friendly with them. But no, they did buy in Hastings. Mm-hmm.
And recreational activities all remain
with their social group.
Yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Were you a gymnast as a child also?
Yes,
Yeah.
We all were in it. And then, as I said, when I went to college, again, these interests, because I wasn't here all the time, I did not stay with those groups because my interests changed a lot. But my parents, until my father died, and my mother still is a member of the organization. She's now 96 years old, and there aren't many of them left in the Yonkers chapter, but they still have somewhat of an organization. It's still in existence, and of course the national organization is ongoing too. So she's still very interested in that.
What kind of transportation did your parents or you use when you were going to and from or around and about Hastings?
Well, my father had a car, so that was no problem. And then, of course, the accessibility of the bus on Broadway. And it was interesting in that my mother still went to the banks in Yonkers, and I guess because she had been doing it for so many years and knew the people there, she did not change to use the banks in Hastings. And I must say, summers when I came home and did work in the city, I took the bus and went down to the Yonkers Railroad Station to commute, as opposed to going to Hastings Station.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. It was convenient. The bus was right there, and I didn't have to walk to Hastings. Time-wise, I don't know that I saved any time, but I did that for years.
I know there was a Pinecrest neighborhood association, I believe. Do you recall anything about your parents being part of it or being involved in any of the community activities that went on? Not necessarily social, but things that might benefit that particular neighborhood.
Well, I know we have a Pinecrest Association now, and I don't know how long it's been in existence. Do you know that? I'm not sure.
I don't know, no.
And I'm trying to think of any instances where they would have meetings and my parents would participate. I think this is a question that I would have to direct to my mother, because as I said, I wasn't home, during those formative years that they were here, so that I can't answer that.
Did you ask how many children in your family?
Oh, no, we didn't ask that.
Okay.
How many children in your family?
Three.
And who were they?
My sister, my brother, and myself. But my sister, let me see, she graduated 44. She was already in Washington, so she never lived here. Mm-hmm. My brother and I lived here. Mm-hmm. And then my brother was in school, so...
Mm-hmm. Your brother was an architect?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Did he work as an architect in this area?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
New York.
But you did say he was involved in some way with one of the local architects?
Well, he knew Mr. Horn, who lived, was a neighbor of ours.
You told us about the relationship with Mr. Horn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Horn designed which house?
Well, his house, and he designed, now I don't know, what do you call that triangular house?
The Bauhaus.
The Bauhaus. I think he designed, my mother will know what houses he designed.
Now that's the house on
The
High Street and Farragut.
The pie-shaped house.
Yes.
Right. There's been a lot of information about that just lately. And you, what was your job?
I was a home economist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have many jobs.
But that's
my background.
That's your basic background.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And who did you work for?
Oh, I started with Public Service of New Jersey, and then I worked for a magazine that went defunct, then I worked for Family Circle magazine, then I worked for the distributor of Whirlpool Appliances in New York, and then I worked Lovable Bra for 6 months, and then they wanted to set up a program that we've been doing in home ec for years, and my last job was Soap and Detergent Association, Trade Association.
I'm interested in your mother and father and their Czech background. Were they born in this country?
I told her that.
Yes.
Oh, you know that.
Yeah.
And when did they come to this country?
I told her that.
Yeah,
I think they were 6 and 12.
When they
met in New York.
How did they meet?
They met through the Sokol organization.
Yeah.
Actually, my mother became the national vice president of the organization, and in 1938 they had huge meets like the Olympics, but they were more exhibition, calisthenics, and apparatus.
Yeah.
And my mother went with the American group as the vice president 38. To Czechoslovakia, and my father had gone as a gymmer. My father was a very good gymmer. He had many medals, and so was my mother.
Yeah,
that's probably why she's so agile and
Probably,
so
yes.
active now. It makes a big difference.
How about the language? Did you speak Czech at home?
No. But my mother did speak it. My sister did speak it I guess she's a born linguist. But then, of course, going to school, we were very sensitive about that. And I guess when my sister first went to school in kindergarten, she was speaking Czechoslovakian.
Can you?
I can understand it, but I don't speak it.
Can you read any?
No, terrible, isn't it?
Does your mother do?
My mother speaks it beautifully.
Yeah.
And her English is good. She does make some mistakes, but her English is really very good. And she reads in English. She doesn't, and she can still speak it. We went back in '79.
To talk to and. No friends left her.
A few, but not many. They're all gone.
None in Hastings, you said. No organization in Hastings that
there
you belong
isn't
to.
any. There really is. And she didn't want to belong to the senior citizens because she said they're too old.
I agree.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah,
she's funny.
Yeah. No,
she loves her garden, and she's very interested in politics. She's a very interesting person. She's very interested in politics. She reads the newspapers and can discuss politics, and she's a wonderful conversationalist, but her interests have been very different.
Did she ever get involved in an interest in politics in Hastings at all?
No ties in Hastings.
Yeah.
No. And I think that goes back. I can see why we're not a sense of insecurity, but they feel more comfortable with their own group. Now that I think is typical of that generation. She's 96, you see. So when she came here, it was what, 1905 or whatever.
Yeah.
And the immigrants were very badly treated, and I think they have that sensitivity, which really doesn't.
How do you mean badly treated? When she came into this
well,
country,
she came. She was only
treated?
well. She was 12 years old. She didn't speak English too well. Her parents lived in New York. No, her father had died. Her mother came here and left my mother with her grandmother to bring her up in Czechoslovakia. And I guess she decided it was time for her to come to the United States. So my mother came with somebody on the boat and lived downtown in Ellis Island.
Do you have any stories about that?
No, I think she can still remember that. But then and it's interesting in that group, they literally walked to their houses because they lived in those tenements down in the Wall Street area. So they were 2 blocks from Battery Park. And there are several buildings there where Czechoslovakians lived, you see. And my mother hated it. And then she started to do waitress work because she went to school, but I don't think she didn't finish high school.
But she did go to a high school in that area?
I think so for a while, but I don't think she graduated. And then she was a waitress and had to learn English on the job. It was very difficult for them.
But did she waitress in
American restaurant? Oh, yeah. Oh, and then she went up to Muskoka Lakes one summer. She was very adventuresome. Really was
at that time. Yeah.
Now my mother's a marvelous cook. But her cooking, now she learned a lot from chefs. Her cooking is more French. We don't eat Czechoslovakian food, a few dishes, but she's a wonderful cook. That's why it's very difficult for me because, I try to simulate what she does, and it's not easy. And she's very critical, and it's nerve-wracking. But she is a wonderful. And when they were at the Sokol Hall, they would have weddings because it was a huge hall. There was a dining room downstairs and upstairs.
I don't know, where is that?
Well, it's not there anymore.
Where was that?
It was on Yonkers Avenue and the Sawmill Parkway. It was overlooking that promontory where that Yonkers Avenue bridge is, a high-rise apartment house there. But there was a huge driveway, and they put the bar in the back because it was built during the Prohibition downstairs. And on that ground level, they had a huge dining room with a huge kitchen. Then above it, they had a huge, you wouldn't call it a gymnasium, but it was like a high school gymnasium because you see that's where they would practice their gymnastics every week with the pommel horse and the rings and the parallel bars, and we would do our calisthenics. And they had a platform so that they also had plays and other things. And my mother was in plays in New York when she was younger. She was a wonderful dancer, and she was in plays. And so my mother, they would have weddings there, and my mother would do the cooking for these weddings for 100, 200 people. And then when I was in high school then, so we would wait on tables when they had these things. It was during the war. We had USO groups come on Friday nights. The USO volunteers and the sailors and soldiers would come there. And they had a field, and they would rent the field out for different activities. It was a wonderful spot, really, to be growing up. And they had bowling alleys. So my brother and I, my sister was in college when we moved there, but my brother and I would have to do work around there, help out, clean the field, do things, clean the bowling alleys.
Yeah. Were they mostly Czech weddings?
No,
costumes at all.
No public. No, it was open to. We had Italian weddings. We had Greek weddings. We had all kinds of weddings. Whoever wanted to rent the hall and have their meals there or whatever they wanted. Some of the big Italian weddings, they would just have big boxes of sandwiches, and they'd have the rolls wrapped up, and they'd have 400 people and they gave out the sandwiches. It was an interesting experience.
Music?
They would rent, they would have music, yeah. But now we would have gymnastic meets, or they would have picnics, and they would have dancing, like the Czechoslovakian, and they would do the beseda on the different national dances. But other organizations would be there too.
Well, even if your mother didn't graduate from high school, she made sure that her 3 kids
Oh,
got
yeah.
through college.
Oh, we all went to Cornell too.
Yeah, a great emphasis.
That's
on
why I went back home, because I felt very indebted to my parents. They worked so hard. They really, terrible. You know, they didn't make much money, and they worked very hard. But it was hard work there, and my father would be down at the bar because he had a dog, and it was in the back, so it was, now you couldn't survive in a place like that. They worked very hard.
Was
but
your
it was
father
fun.
born in this country also?
No, he was born in Czechoslovakia.
And do you know how he happened to come to
his mother was a midwife in Czech. His father died. They had a mill in the town where my father lived, and apparently he built these bags to put the grain in, and his father would travel through the country selling these bags. And
what
his
kind
father
of grain did they
I don't
grind?
know. I don't know. I don't
Corn
really know.
or wheat or
I don't know.
Yeah.
And so then he died, and my grandmother was left with 5 or 6 kids, and she was a very good midwife. And she came to the United States not with the intent to stay, but she brought some of the children over, and then she went back. And my father, I don't know what was that? She lived here for a while, and then she went back, and they fended for themselves.
Did she have any connection in this country
to come here?
to come here?
I don't think so. And I don't know why they came to Yonkers. As I said to Abby, then she and my father's sister and my father pooled their money together and built a 3-story house for everybody. And it was in Yonkers near Lockwood Avenue where the Sawmill Parkway is. And then they were going to build the parkway, so they had to move the house.
But they built
a
they had
3-family
enough room
house.
for all of for anybody who wanted to come.
No, they were not. His family was very different. Now, my mother's mother, everybody that came, or anybody from that town that came to New York, could stay with my grandmother. So my mother said, I remember she used to sleep in the kitchen. She said it was terrible because we always had people there. And it was like a place where the immigrants from that town would come to start out. And they all came, they didn't all come because other people did this, but my grandmother's place was a refuge for them till they got started. But it was terrible. My mother said, I had no home life. She said, I never stayed home. So they really had to fend for themselves.
Any stories about your father's mother when they came over, when they came through Ellis Island?
No, but my mother would probably know that. I should ask that. Ellis Island story. My mother can still remember going through Ellis Island.
What kind of?
I think my mother went through Hamburg. I don't even know who brought her here.
By the way, Ellis Island is doing personal histories like this of people who came from Ellis Island, and if your mother does have stories, they would really value that.
Absolutely.
I'm sure.
You know,
we had their names put on the plaque. I have not seen it. Have you gone down?
No, I haven't.
I had my
Oh,
parents
their
too.
names are on the plaque. Great.
Yeah.
I did put there, and I should have put my grandparents probably. But then my father's mother went back to Czechoslovakia because she preferred it back there. And she practiced. She was really, as my mother said, a doctor because she delivered almost all the children in that town.
Right.
But she worked very hard too to raise her kids. My father was sent to Vienna to learn a practice first, to learn a profession. Not a profession as such. I think he started in automobiles. I don't know what he first. My sister's better at history than I am, but but they sent him to Vienna to learn a profession, and then from there he came to the States, and his brother and he were very close. But my father was actually, even he had a business in Dobbs Ferry where the Ford place is. He did body work on automobiles. He did that for a while in Dobbs Ferry.
Your father?
But not for many years. It was not, well, he started many businesses, but he really wasn't a businessman. You know, he tried.
Yeah.
But it was
so
hard.
there was no socializing in your neighborhood with your mother didn't socialize with the neighbors.
There wasn't, unless I'm wrong, but I don't really remember the group, the neighborhood being a social neighborhood, a closely knit group. Everybody, even now, I mean, we have our Pinecrest Association. I think people are friendly, but you know, it's not a running in and out to each other's houses. Did you get that impression when you interviewed the other people or not?
We got the impression that most people lived there, went to New York to work, came home, closed their door. They were friendly. They greeted each other.
But that was it. That's true.
Yeah. Is the Pinecrest Association still very? Is it active at this point?
Not really, and we should regenerate it, but one of the things now that, because I'm home and I can do it, but I didn't start it, we have a Pinecrest tag sale in June, and so because I'm home, I can write the flyers and go and do the ads, and I like to organize things like that. So we've been doing that. Now then, Liz Brady her husband's president of our Pinecrest Association. We've had a few meetings, but not many.
What do you use the money for when you earn that money from the tag sale?
No, that's everybody's, their own monies. Everybody, it's a neighborhood tag sale.
I thought
but we just started it as a Pinecrest. No, but Joan Mesmer, my neighbor, did get some things from her company. She works for a linen home furnishings company, and did get some, and she sold those last year. And I think the year before, and we donated the money to the Animal Society, and then we asked, and at that time the aqueduct was limelight, but then someone said, well, don't donate it to that, it might get lost in the shuffle, so it was given to the animal thing, but that was only because Joan was willing to donate. No, but it's each person's. But we always have at least 12 or 15 families participating. And then Liz Brady suggested last year that maybe we have a potluck supper after the fair. So we did, and that worked out very well, except we found that just a few people are doing the work. So I said, well, Liz, if you want to do it, you know, let's see if there'll be more volunteers. So we can work on that.
Perhaps you could ask your mother if they had similar type of activities.
We never had tag sales before.
Well, not tag sales, but you know, where people would get together for a particular, maybe it would have been the Pinecrest Association, but you know, to do something that might benefit the neighborhood or...
Yeah, I don't remember anything like that, but I'll ask.
Or even parties. You know, perhaps when your parents moved in, there might have been a neighbor who invited them over to meet other people that she might recall.
I don't think so.
I heard somebody say that the Grays had parties where the Pinecrest, all of the people in Pinecrest were invited.
Well, they may have been, and maybe my parents didn't go. That could be.
Yeah.
That could be. I do remember going to Gray's. It was a Pinecrest Association meeting, but there was a critical issue, and I can't remember exactly what it was. And they offered their home for the meeting. I do remember that.
Is the aqueduct usually the critical?
No, one of them was safety in our neighborhood because, of course, see, the kids from the Graham School, we've had problems with robberies. The kids from the Graham School use the aqueduct, and there have been many incidents. Now, I don't know, you remember Hill, who lived, Mr. Hill was, I think he was an appraiser for the village for a while. Tax assessor. Well, he lived in George Hill. That house is gone, but he lived there. And he was very social, nice, but his home was broken into any number of times, and Bullen's house also because of the accessibility of the aqueduct. So there were concerns about safety, and I do remember a meeting one time about that.
Yeah.
But it didn't have anything to do with aqueduct.
No.
Joanne Sebald was active
Mm-hmm.
with the aqueduct, and we had a meeting about that. And then also she had a special meeting for the Aqueduct Association. People were asked to come, and I think there were only 3 or 4 of us who did go.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to recall what the neighborhood looked like when you first moved in, you know, you mentioned a couple of empty lots and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, I remember vividly.
Yeah, can you kind of describe as if you were taking a walk down the block or something?
Sure, it was starting down Pinecrest, coming down the drive,
Okay.
Okay, as you come down the drive and the right turn is Pinecrest Parkway, that was all an empty lot. Now, the house where the Harts lived, you know, Bonnie Hart? No, well, now there's another house there. That's a, Rutan built a house. As a matter of fact, right. You know Rutan, yes. Okay. As a matter of fact, he asked my brother to draw plans. He wanted to expand his house, and my brother drew plans, and then he decided to go ahead with his own idea, so he didn't use it. But Rutan's built the house, but up until you got to the Levy's, that was all an empty lot. Now, of course, the corner house was there where Moraine lives, and that was quite in rather good condition, but it's gone down progressively over the years.
Is that the one that's partially boarded up? That's
I think you're talking about the Mertens house.
No, not Mertens is around the corner. The Moraine's is on the corner. The stone house that was built was now, I don't know whether it...
Across from Rutan, I think.
Yeah, across from Rutan. That was built for a Russian ballerina.
Remember?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Do you know anything about that?
No, but my mother would. And I think, was it Ziegfeld who was involved in that? Or I'm not sure, but okay. But I don't think she knows her name. And then that house is gone. Now, see, that Moraine was also a Black. Do you know the history? Well, he bought, Mrs. Black lived there, and then she moved out, and then after that, it was empty, and then this Moraine bought the house. Now, he owned a liquor store in Harlem, and he also, I think he lived in Queens, but he bought this house, and his wife never wanted to move up here. So she lived where with Mr. Moraine, and he apparently owned a liquor store in New York or in Harlem and lived here, and then I think whether his wife died or whether they were divorced, I really don't know, but he ended up living here full time with a dog, and the house just went downhill. It's really a total disaster. And one time I just went looking around the property, and there were huge wine barrels, and it could have been that maybe he was running a still in his beautiful living room or what have you, but it has just gone in total disrepair. And there was a problem, I think, with the inheritance, and I don't know who got the property, whether it was a grandchild or an illegitimate child or whatever, but that person now lives there, and it's pretty much the same kind of a situation, and the beautiful slate roof obviously was leaking, so he proceeded to fill it in with tar, and it's really a shame because it was just a show place. That's all I can tell you about that.
And other houses that were there when you moved in, or going down that block again?
All right, Levy's house was there, and then there were empty lots. And then the next house was the home where Vargas lived. I don't know if you remember that name. And then Mr. Horn's house, and then the Cronk's house, which Mrs. Denton owned, and our little chalet in the back. And I think our home was probably built in 1926 or 27. Then there were empty lots, and then Julian's lived in the house which was almost across from Mrs. Denton's home. Now, Julian's, I think, worked for somebody in the neighborhood, and I think they were given that property, if I'm not mistaken. And then there were empty lots all the way down to the end of the street. So there were very few houses. And across the street, as you would go down Pinecrest Parkway, on the left side was the ballerina's home, and then empty lots. Stern's home, I'm not sure when that was built, but perhaps my mother might know that. I can't think of their names. The Dahlbergs live in that house now. Well, the next house was another little house. I don't know when that was built, and then where the Dahlbergs live now. And the two Tudor houses across from us, I think, were built in the 1930s. They were there, Mrs. Denton's home. And then down the street, I can't remember how many houses were there, but I do know that 3 or 4 of them were built, and I think one family owned them, so that when we moved there, several of those houses were empty because the property, they could not settle the estate, and they were empty for years, and then they were fixed up. But there was a lot of wooded area, and apparently from what Mrs. Denton has said, there were just beautiful trees. It was a beautiful street with very unusual shrubs and trees that were shipped from all over. You could probably see that the houses that were built there were built on large pieces of property. And for example, Bluestein's house was really an estate, or where Mr. Patrick lived, or Merton's. Those were all huge homes, people who were living in New York and then moved up into the Hastings area.
Yeah. Now, you don't really know what your house was the chauffeur's house, too.
No, I don't know that, but perhaps my mother knows that, and when it was built, and who lived there.
Because one would think if it's the chauffeur's house that it belonged to a larger property.
Probably the chauffeur to the home next to us where the Bradys live now. I think so, because it's so close to it, makes sense. But they, you see, had quite a bit of property around them. Now, when Horn's home was built, now, and I don't know how much original property was there and when Horn's house was built, but they could have had maybe almost half the street at one time as part of that estate, if you want to call it that.
Now, as that property, those empty lots got developed, were they developed on an individual basis, or you know, by a developer? And
well, I know that the lots next to us, Mrs. Denton asked if my parents were interested in buying those lots, and they were not. And so eventually they were sold to a developer who built 2 small houses on them. Now, the other properties may have been sold as individual lots to people who then built their own homes on them. I think that's correct.
Well, you had mentioned before that you knew that at a certain point when a realtor did bring people around, that the realtor did mention right off the bat that it was an integrated neighborhood.
That was mentioned to me by some of the people who did buy their houses in the area. I was not aware of that, but that was mentioned to me, that it was cited that it was a mixed neighborhood. And that could go back to the 50s, and I don't know what happened after. But, for example, the house next door to us was sold, and I think it probably was the 60s, and it was sold to a black family, and we were not informed of that until the people moved in the house.
Right.
That one woman is the one who sold all of those places.
She was
Chance, yeah.
She was the sister of Mrs. Gray. Judge Gray lived in that house with his family, and it was Juliet and those kids who were part of that.
Okay, it was Chance, and it was Gray's wife's sister.
Now, you were in the middle of asking a question.
See, I'm glad I'm not the only one. We were trying to reconstruct some of these questions that I have to ask my mother. I wonder was it Mrs. Chance who sold the house to blacks, too? Did Mrs. Bourne say that? You don't know that, huh? The corner house.
I don't know.
I don't know. But I do know that she was the realtor that most people mention that they did buy from, that she sent them out here. And I think they were selective about people they sent also.
Yes, I'm sure they were. They were. Yeah. And I must say, we have never, ever had, in all the years that I've lived there and my parents, we have never, ever had any problem on racial lines. Never, ever.
Were you ever invited to any of at the houses of
No.
the black people?
No, even to this day, I have not been invited into any of them. Even Mrs. James, who was our neighbor, I think I was in her house once. Now, Mr. James used to come to see my father because my father had emphysema, and he would come and sit with him.
What kind
You
of
told us the story about Mrs. James.
Right.
Yeah. Where was she from?
Haiti. Her parents were from Haiti. She even had a voodoo room downstairs.
A voodoo room.
And you never got to see that, though. What
She
kind of
wasn't friendly with her neighbors, you said?
what kind of relationship did your parents have with the James?
Just a conversation, hello, and what have you. You know, not too strong, but it was warm, and you know there was no animosity or strong feelings against one another. But Mrs. James was a peculiar person. Her husband was a doll, and she felt very discriminated against. She really had that chip on her shoulder no matter what an incident, no matter what it would be. And if there's anything that happened, you'd say, because I'm black. And my mother would go right back at her.
Do you think she felt that about Hastings, or
No,
about
just
in
life,
general?
just in general,
Yeah.
just in general. Yeah, it was interesting in that she didn't even like blacks. Like she said, the poor blacks in Harlem, she would have nothing to do with them.
And what did they do?
She
a living?
owned property in Harlem. I don't know how much property. And then he would just, the only thing he did was to go and collect the rents. And I don't know who in the family got the property or anything, you know, after that, because none of the family ever talked to us, or we never saw them. We didn't even know who they all were, but once in a while she would have a group up.
Well, who lives there now?
The Bradys.
The Bradys.
But she kept the dog on the front porch. Never let the dog out, and she put newspapers on the porch. You know, you could imagine what, and that dog was, well, one day she let him out, and I went to get him, and he jumped at me and scratched me, and I was concerned about rabies, and she was almost hysterical. There's nothing wrong with that dog, you know, and I jumped in our little shed because I think the dog would have attacked me, but she would let him out unleashed, which was really dangerous. And then she was just found dead one morning. She just died, and the dog was still.
How old was she? Do you have any idea?
I don't think she would ever admit her age. I don't know. I don't really know whether she was in her
60s,
70s.
70s.
I'm not sure. It's hard to tell. Maybe she was in her 70s.
I think there was a lot of socializing, the Adams family, because they had children. Those people who had children of the same age, they seem to.
Well, I think that's
very
like Abby. I think like in Hastings, you know, the norm in a town like this is you have you're married, you have your kids, you would get involved in the PTA and school activities, which is normal for a village, which makes me out in left field, you know, so that you're not interested. Your interests are very, very different, totally different.
Yes.
But I think now all of our kids, we have Orientals in our neighborhood, we have blacks, we have all kinds. It's really a good mix, and the kids all play together. And as I said, we do not have any problems, and we never have. And I think we've kind of lauded ourselves on the fact that, you know, people are talking about blacks moving in a neighborhood, and we've said, well, what problems? We don't have any problems. And I'll say to people, well, I live in an integrated neighborhood, and I've lived there for years, and we've never had a problem. We haven't.
They were educated blacks.
Of course they were.
They were educated. They were people who went out to work every day, and had,
well, you didn't have
They contributed to the neighborhood also.
Well, I don't know how much they contributed. How did they contribute? I don't know. How?
Well, they shopped in the neighborhood. They
did they? I don't know that they did.
In the case of Mr. Adams, he was a minister, and I know he filled in at the Episcopal Church.
Oh, okay.
He had a church.
But I think they're
own.
an exception. It's very interesting too. Like now, this tag sale, that most of the blacks that had lived there did not participate. Now that's interesting.
They're invited to.
Everybody, I go from door to door and leave the flyer, and everybody called twice. and everybody's encouraged. And it isn't that everybody participates, but I noticed that particular. Now, some families more than others.
But are they older members of the community now? Do you think that's
No,
the
they
reason?
have kids. They have kids. But now one family, the Gilliams, have moved in and they've participated, so that changes too. But now the ones in the big, like the Grays or any of those that live in those houses, they never participate. Never. And you never see them. Even at the Pinecrest Association meetings, you don't see any of the blacks.
That's interesting.
Isn't it? It is. And yet they should be as concerned about issues as anybody else. I don't remember one meeting. Mrs. Bourne would go to meetings. She was probably, but Mrs. Bourne was sort of the not the coordinator, but maybe the balance there, where like in Wazi's house, the kids, they're teenagers, and I know a couple of times they've had parties, and they've had high school kids, and one night there were just so many of them, and I think maybe a few of them were drunk, and the police, someone called the police and came, and Mrs. Bourne was very concerned because they were blacks again, you see. Now there were whites there, but because they were blacks, she didn't want others to feel that this was a problem.
But it was a mixed social party?
Oh, absolutely. And the kids who play, they're all mixed. There is no problem, but as you said, it's a different educational level. But I think that's typical of Hastings, isn't it?
Even so, one of the interviews that I read spoke about once the children turned teenagers, the mixing stopped, and that the parties became more or less segregated.
I think the dating may not have gone on then. I know Georgia Hanovich, who works here. She was telling me Mrs. Bourne's one of her daughters was a good friend of hers, and they still keep in touch. Some of the relationships have carried over from the childhood.
Well, Joan Mesmer's daughter was very friendly with Mrs. Black's daughter.
Yeah.
But now they've married and gone their separate ways, but they were friends for years now. And I don't know what the dating habits were. I really couldn't tell you that. But now I know, like now the Noisees who live 3 houses down, when they have parties, and they have a lot in the summertime, only blacks go to that. But yet now around on the other side, they have a lot of big parties, and they're all mixed. So now whether they're their professional counterparts, I really couldn't say.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. But you don't see a steady flow of people in and out, and blacks and whites, and that you don't see. But even the Orientals don't mix that much either.
Well, it's true. Like your parents didn't mix that much. I mean, that's just a natural thing.
Sure, it is. It is. And now we have the Orientals. The children do, but not the parents. They cling to their own, which is not unusual, I don't think. Well, have we done?